One of the biggest problems that we have as Africans is our inability to tell our stories. Our inability to tell about the past, the present, and the ability to make our people understand the past and the present and the lessons that are in there for us to be able to know how to manage our future for our benefit. I'm reminded immediately by the story of Zimbabwe. This country that's going through an economic crisis, protests, political unrest, scarcity of goods and services, and a collapsing economy. The problem that we have there is no one has ever told the whole story or the full story about what it is that is happening in Zimbabwe and why Zimbabwe is in the position that it's in. A lot of times the assumption is that when people see refugees coming from Zimbabwe, skilled workers crossing the Limpopo, some of them swimming through crocodile-infested waters, a lot of people just assume that Zimbabwe is a poor country, it's badly managed, and therefore that's why Zimbabweans are coming to South Africa, because South Africa is much better managed. The Western media even advances the narrative that says that Zimbabwe was governed by an idiot leader called Robert Mugabe, and Robert Mugabe chased away white farmers, and the moment white farmers left, Zimbabweans began to die of hunger, and when Zimbabweans died of hunger, they began to cross into South Africa. And the ANC even picks up on this narrative, and they try to advance the same narrative because they are trying to say to the world and to South Africans that look at us, we are better blacks, unlike those idiots in the north who chased away white people, and when they chased away white people, they destroyed their country because of corruption. We are not as corrupt as them. But what is said is that the ANC understand that the true reason why Zimbabwe is where it's at is not because of corruption, mismanagement, and all these other reasons, but it is because Zimbabwe has been at war with the most powerful nation in the world for the past 18 years. The ANC fully understands that the Americans, the Europeans, Canadians, and Australians united and instituted war on Zimbabwe to try and destroy it and stop it from decolonizing, because they feared that if Zimbabwe succeeded to decolonize, it would influence South Africa. The ANC also understands that they have been complicit in the destruction of Zimbabwe, in the aspect that when Zimbabwe has been getting destroyed by this warfare, the South African government accepted money that was laundered out of Zimbabwe by Rhodesians, Britons, Americans, and the imperialist powers that were in Zimbabwe to be transferred from South Zimbabwe into South Africa. And they even offered those very same people who were stealing and illegally externalizing money from Zimbabwe into South Africa, they gave them citizenships and permanent residencies. The ANC also understands that they have never stopped voting with the Americans in the UN, even though they knew that the Americans were destroying the Zimbabwean economy and they were cannibalizing that economy. We saw the ANC also sabotaging Libya when Jacob Zuma went and signed an agreement that allowed the no-fly zone in Libya, which resulted in Gaddafi getting removed. The ANC has been complicit in helping imperialists to destroy any nation that wants to decolonize on the African continent. Now, it's therefore important for you to understand that Zimbabwe has been at war with the United States government, the Europeans, Canada and Australia for the past 18 years, and that is the reason why the economy of Zimbabwe is where it is. The very first form of sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe was imposed in 2001 when Zimbabwe began its land reform program without compensation. This is a land reform program that was started after the British government refused to stick to the agreement of it paying 50% for all land that the Zimbabwean government would pay for or buy from white farmers. Robert Mugabe, when he initiated the independence of Zimbabwe, agreed to buy land at a 50-50 split with the Britons, Americans, and the Europeans. But over time, the British and the Americans were no longer interested in allowing land to be taken, because most of the land that was owned in Zimbabwe was not owned by farmers, but by British companies, American companies, and very wealthy royal family members. Robert Mugabe realized that he was never going to take land because the British were always going to frustrate it by not paying their half. So he decided to do what was the fast-track land reform program without compensation. The moment he started that, and it's important to say that he only started it after South Africa had achieved its independence, because the ANC asked Zimbabwe to stop its land reform program until it got its independence. Robert Mugabe waited for the ANC to write its constitution, get ready to govern, and then he continued the land reform program. Once he started that land reform program, the British and the Americans threatened him with sanctions. Robert Mugabe said that we went to war for this land, so I will take the land irrespective if you're going to put on sanctions. The first sanctions were Zidera in 2001. These sanctions were tailored to stop Zimbabwe from getting loans from the IMF, World Bank, International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and other multilateral lending institutions. More importantly, it was designed to stop Zimbabwe from asking for debt cancellation, so that Zimbabwe must remain with its debt, so that it would not have the power to change its economy. So they refused Zimbabwe the right to cancel debt. And Zimbabwe had a number of debts that they could have asked for cancellation. For instance, the colonial debt that Zimbabwe inherited of $800 million, which is $3 billion today, that the Rhodesian government utilized to buy weapons to stop our parents from getting independence. Zimbabwe could also ask the cancellation of debt for all the money that it had to borrow from the IMF to build schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, and all other facilities and services that were required for the majority of the population. Zimbabwe could ask for the cancellation of that debt because that debt was incurred, yet it was supposed to be incurred by the colonizer during their colonialism, according to the ICESPRO Treaty, the UN Charter, and to a certain extent the League of Nations Chapter 11, that said that all colonizers had the right to improve the lives of non-self-governing peoples by giving them education, healthcare, and institutions that teach them about their human rights. The British government, the Rhodesian government never did that, so the Zimbabwean government had to take loans to do those things while paying white farmers for their land. So the Zimbabwean government had grounds to ask for the cancellation of such debt. This is especially considering that the British government and the Rhodesians never paid reparations for the colonization of Zimbabwe, which was a 90-year colonization. So by blocking Zimbabwe from cancellation of debt, Zimbabwe would be burdened by a huge debt for a long time to come. But Robert Mugabe didn't care. The British and the Americans had hoped that if Robert Mugabe continued with the land reform program, he would eventually lose some elections in 2002. But unfortunately for them, Robert Mugabe did not lose those elections. This is when they came up with the second level of sanctions, which are now war and defense sanctions. In 2003, George Bush came up with what were called the executive order sanctions. In these executive order sanctions, the very first thing the United States government did was to declare Zimbabwe a national emergency threat against the United States of America. In the correct wording, they declared a national emergency on Zimbabwe by saying Zimbabwe is an extraordinary, unusual threat against the United States' national, economic, and security interests. By identifying Zimbabwe as a threat, by identifying Zimbabwe as a nation that is a threat against the United States, measures to mitigate or neutralize this threat had to be instituted. In other words, you have to understand that by declaring Zimbabwe a national threat against the United States was literally declaring war against Zimbabwe. And the measures that they came up with to manage or mitigate this threat were two acts: the National Emergency Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was an act that attacks the enemy with economic weapons, financial weapons. With these weapons, they would stop any nation, any company in America from trading with Zimbabwe. More importantly, they would stop any of their financial institutions from transferring or processing any transfers or payments to any Zimbabwean government company, to the Zimbabwean government, or to the Zimbabwean banking system, therefore isolating Zimbabwe from the international banking system. You've got to understand that 70% of all financial transactions in the world go through the SWIFT system. And the SWIFT system mainly uses the reserve currency, which is the United States dollar, and that automatically means that most transactions are done through the American banking system, and Zimbabwe would be isolated from that. Another condition was that no American company was allowed to do business with 144 designated nationals of Zimbabwe, which included the government of Zimbabwe, and the companies of the government of Zimbabwe, which include the companies that trade Zimbabwe's resources, like the ZMDC. With that, they basically say isolated Zimbabwe from international trade. The restriction was such that no company can buy, sell, or trade with Zimbabwe, meaning we cannot get software, technology, machinery, tools, or any other form of economic factors that can allow Zimbabwe to be able to trade, or to produce, or to process its resources. To the extent that it's even difficult for Zimbabwe or its government institutions or any parastatals in Zimbabwe to buy fuel, medicine, or any of those other strategic inputs that most other governments would buy for themselves. What this also did is that the American government also said not only are American companies restricted, but any other company that wants to do business with the American government would also have the same restrictions. Because when you want to come and do business with the United States, but you've been doing business with any country that is under US sanctions, you could be investigated, assets can be confiscated, and the directors of your companies can be arrested the moment they go into the United States or any related countries or partner countries, like what has happened right now with the Huawei executives that are being arrested for doing business with Iran. The very same sanctions on Iran are the ones that are on Zimbabwe. The very same sanctions that were on Iraq and Libya are the ones that are on Zimbabwe. And this is what it is that people have to understand. So the United States government put a restriction to say no company in America and no company wanting to do business in America can do business in Zimbabwe for anything over $50,000 without a license from the United States president. And for those companies that choose to do business in Zimbabwe, at any time the United States president can give an instruction for any company in America and any company doing business in America to be investigated for contravening its sanctions and have its assets frozen, have its monies confiscated, and potentially its directors arrested and jailed for over 20 years. This is why it becomes so risky for anybody to invest in Zimbabwe, and that's why investment is not coming into Zimbabwe, because there are punitive measures that have been instituted by the United States, her European partners, Americans and Australians to stop any business taking place between European Western nations and Zimbabwe, and even Asian nations that want to do business in Europe and America trading with Zimbabwe. The South African government understands this well, but they also know that these very same rules are the reason why Libya was destroyed economically before it was destroyed militarily by the Americans. And this is where the most important part comes. The National Emergency Act, on the other hand, gives America the power to deal with Zimbabwe militarily. By the executive orders that declared war on Zimbabwe, or that called Zimbabwe a national emergency threat against America, American troops can be put on Zimbabwean soil without the American president needing to go and ask permission from Congress. After he's put his troops on Zimbabwean soil, all he has to do is give an update to Congress every single 3 months about what it is that is going on in Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is already in a war that is also military. The only thing is that America hasn't yet put its troops on Zimbabwean soil. But because America has not put its troops on Zimbabwean soil does not mean that America is not undertaking military action in Zimbabwe, because military action can include secret service people that are sabotaging on the Zimbabwean soil. And right now you've got issues of cholera that have been happening in Zimbabwe. The last time we had a huge cholera and anthrax outbreak in Zimbabwe was during our liberation war, when Rhodesian soldiers that were backed by US mercenaries, British mercenaries, were putting anthrax, and the biggest anthrax outbreak in Africa and in the world was because those anthrax spores were being put in our water bodies by these British and Rhodesian troops that were in Zimbabwe. Today we've got a cholera outbreak. How do we know that that cholera outbreak is not being caused by the Americans, as was done by the Rhodesians, who also caused cholera during our liberation struggle? There are many other ways that the Zimbabwean economy is being sabotaged, where Zimbabweans have the money, but there's all of a sudden a scarcity of goods. But Zimbabweans have got both US dollars and the Zimbabwe currency to buy goods and services. Why are there no goods and services in the country? There are cartels controlling the fuel industry. Cartels that are said to include white monopoly capital from South Africa, Trafigura, what do we call this company? Glencore. Those are now international global companies. Part and parcel of the sabotage that is affecting Zimbabwe. It is important for South Africans to understand what is happening in Zimbabwe, because the very same sanctions have been designed to be applied on South Africa if South Africa radically economically transforms the economy, or if South Africa chooses to take land without compensation. The ANC government know this, but they have been silent. The very first part of war is information. The very first part of war is to destroy propaganda of the enemy. The ANC have been quiet, together with all African leaders who continue to vote with the United States in its own personal agenda. We even saw Jacob Zuma voting with the Americans for a no-fly zone in Libya, which eventually led to the removal of Gaddafi, who was removed because he wanted to create an all-Africa gold currency. Now, if this is what is happening in Africa, where we work against our own interests, what kind of a continent are we going to have when we continue to allow imperialism and recolonization of Africa, which is now complete in Libya and which is almost incomplete in Zimbabwe? But now people like Julius Malema understand that South Africa, if isolated like Zimbabwe was isolated, will fall. So now he's talking about national unity, continental unity, and Pan-Africanism. But where was the talk of Pan-Africanism when Zimbabwe was isolated? Where was the talk of Pan-Africanism when Muammar Gaddafi was removed with the complicity of the South African government and the ANC government? These are conversations we've got to start having with each other as Africans. If we are serious about emancipation, if we are serious about decolonization, we cannot have the ANC playing double standards or playing two sides. We cannot have the ANC wanting to maintain white monopoly, but at the same time hoping for justice for South Africans, because the two don't go hand in hand. I hope we understand. Lizwe letu.